Welcome, everyone. We are going to be getting started in a few minutes. For those who are joining us through Zoom, and if you want translation, si desean escuchar en español, selecciona el idioma debajo de interpretación y pueden cambiarlo a español para escuchar. Gracias a nuestro traductor, Gabe Guerrero. Everyone who's listening in English, no need to do anything. You just listen to English. But we'll be getting started in just a few minutes. We're very excited to hear from our presenter, Dr. Bickman. And we're very excited for the people who committed, well, either were lucky enough to live nearby or committed enough to come out to Vegas to take full advantage of being able to be here. Because after we get to receive Dr. Bickman's presentation, everyone who's here will have some time for some Q&A and be able to ask questions that are near and dear to your hearts or to those of people you're helping so you can be better equipped to help them out more. And I'm sure that the people on the Zoom, we've got 202 right now, they will be eager to hear whatever questions you're asking and getting answered. Well, on that note, I'd love to introduce Dr. Bickman. I don't know how long it's been now since you've been helping out with Unicity. 8 years. Wow. That's crazy. Time flies. But Dr. Bickman, obviously, beyond being a very accredited scientist and incredible professor at BYU, one of the huge values that he brings for us at Unicity is his ability to explain concepts that are incredibly complex, that go on in the body, and not that many people really understand them, but he can explain them in a way that the person who's learning about this for the first time today understands what actions to take coming out of it to make impact. And that's what it is all about, right? We're here to make life better. And if we don't know what to do to make your life better, then it doesn't really matter. And so Dr. Bickman and how he breaks down insulin resistance will really empower anyone listening today on some very clear actions that you can begin to take starting tonight and definitely tomorrow to make your life better, and especially with incorporating the tools that we provide through FeelGreat and at Unicity. So on that note, Dr. Bickman, your stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. In fact, this is such an intimate group that I can't help but wax a little personal for just a moment. So it was about 8 years ago that Sam's cousin ended up telling her uncle, Stuart, all about a professor whose class she was taking at BYU. And this professor was just apparently dynamic enough and memorable enough that she said, you've got to talk to this professor. And so the very first talk I ever gave for Unicity, I was invited to give a talk in Southeast Asia. And I thought, I'm going to talk about insulin resistance because it's the only thing I know anything about. And it's the most common problem worldwide. And that really was the first step that I ever took into this realm of putting ideas to work, which is something that as an academic, I take very personally. Something that I don't like about academia is that too many professors and scientists are okay just having ideas and thinking that the idea itself is valuable. It is not. An idea is only as valuable as it can be applied. And even then, the application of that idea must actually benefit someone's life. This is where you come in. I want you to look at my role as presenting to you an idea where my hope is I've taught these concepts to you in such a way that you can then go teach someone else. I'm the professor right now. You will then go be the professor to someone else, but you will have a tool to help them actually solve some of the problems that we're going to be talking about. Now, knowing that I had a bit of a mixed audience here and always looking at these as opportunities to test out some new ideas, and Sam lets me be a little flexible with this, the first part of my talk will be a little familiar to some of you, and then the whole second part of the talk is brand new. But still me thinking about ways for you to go talk to other people about some of this stuff. Now, just as a reminder, insulin, why would I have devoted my career to insulin resistance? Through my PhD studies, through my postdoctoral work, it's because this is truly the single most common problem, not only in the United States. where we know that metabolic health is compromised in up to nine in every 10 adults. Now, as a reminder, you want to think that we have it worse than anywhere else in the world. It's a kind of uniquely American thing to think that America is the worst. I say that as a foreigner, not being from the US originally. This is not true, that as bad as metabolic health is here, if you look at insulin resistance and prediabetes, the top 10 countries, we're not even in the top 20. So this is a problem very much globally, particularly through the Middle East and Asia. And then we start coming over to North America. Even in our own backyard, Mexico has worse rates of insulin resistance than we've got. So this is very much a problem domestically, and it's just as much a problem abroad. Now, I'm presenting this in the context of metabolic health, and I've already gotten a little bit ahead of myself, but just so that you know, it's very likely that your friends and family will know what the term metabolic syndrome is. That's a term that everyone has heard to some degree or another. And metabolic syndrome is this cluster of clinical complications that always go together. They have too much fat around the middle of the body. Their blood pressure is too high. Their blood glucose is too high, or they have dyslipidemia. Their blood lipids are in a bad range. This is the metabolic syndrome. But before it was ever called the metabolic syndrome, it was referred to as the insulin resistance syndrome, which as a scientist I prefer because I prefer precision. I want terms to be as precise as my hairdo. I want everything to be perfectly precise and accurate. Nothing out of place, no hair missed when you shave it. I want precision, and even in terms. So you would teach your friend, and we go to the same barber. You'd teach your friend that the metabolic syndrome is the most common problem worldwide, and it actually is simply a problem of insulin resistance. And then they're going to ask you, well, is it really that big of a problem? Yes. Virtually every chronic disease, what I refer to as the plagues of prosperity, all have one thing in common, namely that to varying degrees, they are all affected or a result of insulin resistance. Now, once again, let me be precise, just as you will be. I am not saying that insulin resistance is the only cause of breast and prostate cancers. No, but it is a common cause and contributor of those two cancers in particular. I'm not saying insulin resistance is the only cause of heart disease or type 2 diabetes. Actually, in type 2 diabetes, it is. So that one doesn't work. But even, say, infertility or depression or migraines, you would look at all of these disorders and think none of them have anything to do with each other. And that's simply not true. These plagues of prosperity or these diseases of civilization are all related to insulin resistance. They're all branches coming off the same tree. The paradigm that I want us to embrace is that rather than pruning or trimming each branch only for the branch to grow back, let's just cut the whole tree down. Let's address the insulin resistance at the roots. By the end of today, you're going to understand all of the roots, and you're going to, in a way that I've not presented before, ever actually, in Unicity or anywhere else. But you're also going to have the tools. You'll have the knowledge, and you uniquely have the tools. Now, your friend is going to ask you what insulin resistance is. You tell them, and I often use this comparison to a coin. Insulin resistance is a problem with two parts. The first part is that some cells of the body aren't responding to insulin anymore. That's one side of the coin. But if I'm holding this coin, there's another side. And the other side of that coin is that insulin levels are elevated. Those are not the same thing. One is that insulin isn't working as well as it used to. And the second is that insulin levels are high. Those are two separate problems that always come together. And it's a topic for another time to go into how these two problems, which always come together, end up causing or contributing to all of these chronic diseases that we're all so afraid of. Now, your friend is going to want to know where insulin resistance comes from. There are three primary causes of insulin resistance, and I would even want you to use those terms. I would want you to say primary because there are secondary contributors, but we don't have time for those. We want to, and you don't have time, and your friend doesn't have time. You focus on the primary causes. And the three primary causes, which are each capable on their own of causing insulin resistance, is stress, inflammation, and the big word that just means elevated insulin levels in the blood. Hyper means high. Insulin, of course, is the hormone. And then emia. Anytime you hear that suffix emia, it means in the blood. High insulin in the blood, hyperinsulinemia. Now, in the past, when I've given my Unicity talks, and even when I've given talks at science meetings, I just gave a talk at a medical convention in London just a couple weeks ago. I talked about hyperinsulinemia. That's always the one I focus on because it's the biggest. It's the most important. So just to be thorough, because some of you haven't heard me speak before, and just because it's a topic too important to overlook, let's just revisit that one briefly for a few minutes. So as insulin is chronically elevated, the body becomes increasingly resistant to it. Now, you're going to wonder what these little things are here. That is the PubMed ID, and PubMed is the government database for all published biomedical articles. These are just my citations for you to refer to so that you never know, you never have to worry whether Dr. Bickman is making anything up. I don't. The only thing I make up are my athletic exploits that I tell my kids about, that what I accomplished in high school. Those are my only fibs. Everything else is perfectly accurate. Now, the solution then is to turn insulin down. If chronically elevated insulin is the most important cause of insulin resistance, then the simple solution is give the body a break. Bring the insulin down. In the past, I've presented two different ways to do this. I'm going to adjust these slightly for my talk at the Global Convention in Bangkok. Is anyone going to be there, by the way? See you there. That'll be a new talk in and of itself, but it's going to be kind of meshed ideas from some of what I've worked out here in these Vegas meetings. So I've mentioned before the control carbs and the frequently fasting. Let's just revisit these because they are so important. You can never talk about this enough with your friends. Why the focus on carbohydrates? I don't want you to think that I am uniquely opposed to carbs for no reason. The focus on carbohydrates comes for two reasons. One is that globally, 71% of all calories come from starches and sugars. That is an exceptionally sobering statistic. So the vast majority of what we're eating globally is coming from starches and sugars. Unfortunately, this isn't coming from whole fruits and vegetables. It's coming from starches and sugars that are in bags and boxes with barcodes. Now, why does this matter? It's because of what these macronutrients do to insulin. This is the moneymaker slide. This is why I am such an advocate of managing your macros, that you want to focus on carbs and proteins because they have little to no effect on insulin. Pure carbohydrate, however, has a substantial effect on insulin. You eat a pure carbohydrate, which is very easy to do. That's essentially just something as simple as bread, but nowadays we have all kinds of options of just pure carbohydrate. And then insulin will go up 10 to 20 times and it will stay elevated for up to 3 hours. Importantly, this isn't a person, the rare individual who's very insulin sensitive. Most people are not insulin sensitive, and in them, the insulin will not only go several times higher, but stay elevated for substantially longer. Now, one given load of glucose, a very modest amount of carbohydrate that someone can eat, ripping open the bag or box with a barcode and consuming it, their insulin can stay elevated for up to 5 hours. Now, one of the most remarkable findings that I'd stumbled across from an old paper was finding that even in the most insulin-sensitive, young, healthy humans, like college-aged males can do all kinds of metabolic damage and abuse to their bodies and just shrug it off. They are just the strongest, most once upon a time, at least. I'm a college professor, and I can tell you, unfortunately, it's changing rapidly. But classically speaking, that is the group that is the most metabolically bulletproof. Even then, even in those bodies, if they eat a couple bowls of cereal worth of carbohydrate, their insulin can be elevated for up to 10 hours. Thus, I focus on this the most because most people are spending every waking moment, and sometimes now even all of their sleeping moments, in a state of elevated insulin. And when insulin is high excessively, the body starts to become resistant to it. All right, so what can you do? You tell your friend, perhaps the most important thing is focus on fiber. In nature, when you're eating starches, it should come with fiber. We have pulled the two apart because food manufacturers don't want fiber in those foods because then you'll eat less. because fiber will control your appetite a little better. And we'll talk about that in a second. But when you take that insulin response to carbohydrate and add fiber to it, and you can tell your friend that you have a very good one, it will bring down the insulin response. In fact, speaking of balance, we looked at the glycemic response with an in-house study, and this is just as a point of interest for you. Classically, Unicity has said to take balance 15 minutes before the meal. That orange line is what happens when you take it with the meal. So it actually is a little better. And I understand that's kind of changing a little bit in real time, which is great. But let that even be a testament to how determined this company is to be right at the cutting edge. That to my great delight, Unicity is always willing to think like a scientist, which is if we find evidence that what we thought was wrong, we'll pivot. There are not a lot of companies, I believe, that are going to be humble enough to have that kind of change of direction when it's called upon. Okay, now what else? You have another tool you're thinking. You're thinking, I have something else I can share with my friend. There's also something called chlorogenic acid that you'll want to talk about, because these are direct quotes from this study, but just read these quotes, but just finding that chlorogenic acid, this bottom one, is able to lower the glycemic impact of foods and chronically lower background blood glucose levels. So even in a fasted state, chlorogenic acid is helping control blood sugar. And of course, as blood sugar is better controlled, insulin will be too. Now your friend would say, well, how can I get these chlorogenic acid? And you say, boy, I've got something that can help you. This is what I was alluding to earlier, where you have solutions to these problems. All right, now that's enough for the control carbs part. What about the frequently fasting? The fact is, minute for minute, the fastest way to lower insulin is fasting. The problem with fasting, of course, is that you get hungry. So your friend is going to say, yeah, but I can't fast. I just get too hungry. Well, what's the best way to help them control their hunger? One thing you could tell them is, you need a little theobromine. And they'll say, what is that? And you'll say, theobromine is a plant molecule that actually it falls into this category known as a bitter tastant. So the very first global convention I ever attended was when Unimate came out, actually. It was when it was announced and shared. I vividly remember, in part because I was so starstruck. You know, as an academic who goes to meetings, it's just a bunch of boring scientists who don't really care about what each other's doing because they've already read all your papers and they know what you're going to talk about. This was the first time where I saw, people like clapping and standing and getting excited about something other than maybe like an old Billy Joel concert or something like that. But it felt like a concert. It was amazing. But my point in bringing that up is that I heard people mention a hint of a bitter taste. If you ever have a friend who says, boy, there's a hint of a bitter taste, you'll say, yeah, by design. Because as much as you taste the bitterness in your mouth, a hint of a bitter taste, you actually have bitter taste receptors in your intestines. And when those bitter taste receptors are sensing something like the theobromine, they tell the brain, there's a direct signal. You know that they say the gut is the second brain. There's a direct signal from your gut to your brain saying, let's eat less. So if they say, boy, this has a unique taste, you tell them it does indeed. It's supposed to have a unique taste. It's the theobromine, and theobromine helps control appetite. And I have a way for you to get some theobromine in your lifestyle plan. But also I'd mentioned that fiber has a satiety-inducing effect. Now, the obvious part of the fiber is everyone always says, well, it provides bulk. Yeah, it puts something in your stomach and it can help you push off some acute hunger. But that's too boring for a scientist like me to focus on. I want you to focus on something more exciting, which is the short-chain fatty acids. I am an enormous fan of short-chain fats because of our very sterile eating environment where everything we eat is preserved in a package or preserved in a fridge or frozen. We don't get a lot of fermented foods. In our history as humans, as adults, most dairy we consumed would have been fermented. A lot of plants we consumed, if we hoped to store them at all, it would have been fermented in the ground or bottled up perhaps if we had such means. But fermentation is what gives something that little bit of a sour taste. You know what I'm talking about? When I lived in Russia almost 30 years ago, 25 years ago, I fell in love with something called kefir. Kefir, it's the Russian word for this kind of soured milk, and it has such a delightfully sour taste. It's because of the fermentation. And anytime you taste something sour in nature, it's fermented and it's the short chain fats that you're tasting actually. Now, you're thinking, when you take Balance, you don't taste something sour because you haven't made them yet. Our eukaryotic cells of the human body do not use fiber for fuel, but the bacteria in our intestines can. And when they eat those fibers, they make short chain fatty acids. And then our guts will absorb those short chain fatty acids, and we have no potential to store them. You cannot store a short chain fat, they must be burned. And so it stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis. So you make more mitochondria. It stimulates a process called ketogenesis. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Ben, you've really gone off on a tangent. I have. But back to satiety, it also is a signal to the brain to say, hey, we're good. We don't need to eat as much. So once again, you have a mechanism. You tell your friend, I just can't fast. You say, you need more short chain fats. And they say, how on earth can I get some short chain fats? And you say, well, you can make them with these prebiotic fibers, and I have a good way for you to get them. Now, let's move on to something that I have kept my finger on the pulse of since the very beginning. During my dissertation work, we had one of the first funded projects from Johnson & Johnson to study a class of hormones called the incretins. These are hormones that come from the gut, and this has become the hottest topic in biomedical pharmacological realm to a point I've never seen before. Just as a point of interest, the intestines are a very active endocrine organ. One of the classes I teach as a professor is a class in graduate endocrinology, and I love it. In another life, I would have been a pediatric endocrinologist. I just am fascinated by hormones. Now, I teach my students that once upon a time, we looked at hormone glands, the hormone-releasing glands of the body as just being the standard ones, like the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the gonads, and that was the end of it. Now, just so you know, literally every single tissue in the body is an endocrine gland. It's almost boring. What used to be a very exclusive club is now just a party for everyone, including the intestines. But literally, the heart makes hormones, the bone makes hormones, your skin makes hormones, and so too does your gut. And it makes a lot. The most famous, what's the most famous one? Do you guys know? GLP-1 is the most famous. There's never been anything like this. This kid went from being unknown 30 years ago, practically, to becoming the biggest kid on the block. And there's no hormone that is obsessed over as much as GLP-1 is. This is the hormone that is leveraged with drugs like Wegovy and Ozempic. Even if you'd never heard of GLP-1, you sure as heck have heard of Wegovy and Ozempic. Now, why? It's because GLP-1 does a lot of stuff. The main thing that GLP-1 does, especially at these Wegovy doses, is that it slows the stomach to a point where it can become actually quite lethal, frankly. But it will slow the stomach and make you just not feel as hungry, but sometimes to catastrophic consequence. It'll also directly act at the brain, telling the brain to eat a little less. So that's going to help with fasting, right? Because that's still the overall topic that I'm talking about. But the consequences, if I were one of the talks I gave in London a couple of weeks ago was all about the GLP-1 drugs. I'm something of an expert on GLP-1 drugs, and so I was there speaking about them. I could go on and on about the negative consequences of these drugs, but that's not what I want to focus on. But just so that you're aware, not only are people experiencing paralysis of the intestines, which can kill them, they are also up to 40% of the weight they lose is coming from lean mass, which is mind-boggling. So for every 10 pounds of weight that they've gone down, 4 pounds is coming from their muscle and their bone. That's a problem because in the US, about 70% of people, after they've been on the drugs for 2 years, get off the drug on their own. They decide they don't want to be on it anymore because they get sick of feeling sick. When you hear people say, oh, my cravings went away, that's just a nice way of saying I feel kind of nauseous all the time and I just don't want to eat. It just doesn't sound as good to say it like that because people want to brag about it. And I don't mean to speak too flippantly about that. And if, in case some of you are on these drugs or you know someone who is, I understand the temptation. But the problem is up to 70% of people choose to get off them at 2 years in because they get sick of feeling sick. Weight regains immediately and completely. But imagine if you were a 60-year-old woman. One of those, and you've lost, for every 10 pounds, 6 pounds was fat, 4 pounds was muscle and bone. Guess which one of those masses comes back very quickly? And guess which one will never come back? The lean mass, yes. One of those, no matter what she does, within reason, she's never going to get back that muscle and that bone that she lost. So these drugs they have a terrible price to pay. So how can you take advantage of those benefits? Some of the benefits, albeit more modest, of course, but without the negative effects. You have some ways that can help. So within Unamate, there are chlorogenic acid, EGCG, and then ferulic acid. Each of these on their own are known to stimulate GLP-1 production from the intestine. So this is a way of boosting your own production. Whereas the drug is coming in and artificially activating this GLP-1 pathway, it's kind of dialing it up to an 11 or even a 20 or a 30. You just say, look, there's consequences to this. Let's get some of the benefit, more modest benefits, but it will also come without those negative consequences. And here's one way to do it. So chlorogenic acid will do it, ferulic acid will do it, and EGCG will do it. And your friend would say, where can I get all of those things? You tell them where they can get it. Also, balance doesn't want to be left out of this conversation either, and it has a place where the prebiotic fibers have been shown to activate the very cells, the L cells that make GLP-1 from the gut. So once again, we have a direct mechanism here to boost our own production of GLP-1. So let's summarize this as we've reached the halfway point. So we were talking about control carbs and fasting and how you have some ways to help people take advantage of this. Now let's get into some of the new stuff, if you're ready. Okay, now some of you are thinking, Ben, you had talked about 3 primary causes of insulin resistance and you only spoke about 1. So let's now go into the other 2. And let's see how it goes, because I've not presented on this sort of stuff. I literally made these slides brand new and finished them in my hotel just a couple hours ago, because I can never be content with anything I've made except my own children. And my wife did most of the work. Anyway, so let's talk about inflammation first. When you talk about these 3 primary causes of insulin resistance, I would strongly encourage you to focus most of your time on hyperinsulinemia. But I even have to admit, people are obsessed with talking about inflammation. Even though they should be obsessed with talking about insulin, nobody is. Some of you have a copy of my book, Why We Get Sick. Why didn't I say what is insulin resistance and why you should care? Because no one would have cared. No one would have cared, unfortunately. So I have enough of a marketing brain that I knew I got to pick a better name for this book. But inflammation is something people love talking about. So maybe you find that your friend would rather talk about inflammation, so be it. You'll be an expert. When you talk about inflammation, make sure you talk about cytokines. Cytokines are basically hormones of the immune system. These are proteins that are released from immune cells, like macrophages and other white blood cells, that will move through the body and turn on these immune pathways, or what we could call inflammation. But as these cytokines keep going up, the body becomes ever more insulin resistant. And some of these citations right here, by the way, are mine. This exact phenomenon is what I devoted my postdoctoral fellowship to understanding when I worked with Duke Medical School years ago. So this is kind of what I initially made my name for, understanding how cytokines and inflammation cause a reduced insulin sensitivity. Now, often when we think about cytokines and inflammation, we only think about infections and illness. And while that is true, it's also more often the case that the person needs to be worried about insulin resistance because of things like autoimmune diseases or inhaled pollutants, particulates from the air, whether it's cigarette smoke, whether it's exhaust from vehicles. That also contributes to inflammation, which then causes insulin resistance. But the one that is the most relevant of all is when fat cells get too big. And we'll come back to that idea in just a moment. But when you think about inflammation, people have a pretty common understanding of it, although it's too narrow-minded. Typically, when we think of inflammation, we think about a big angry wound, right? If you think inflammation, this is kind of what you're picturing. And that's not wrong, as this wound is, there's damage here, there's microbes that could be here. One of the main features of inflammation is you take a blood vessel, which is very, very tight and has a total integrity along its length. Nothing is really, only it's controlling very well what's going in or out. But as you have this damage or this infection, you make the blood vessel more permeable. Now you have these pores. So the blood vessel, which used to be really tightly knitted together on its walls, it starts to open up a little bit. And now you have stuff that can get out, including a lot of just water. And so then you have swelling. Typically, when people think of inflammation, they actually just think of one part of it, which is the swelling. But that's not something that happens with a lot of the other causes of inflammation. This is something that usually only happens with wounds or, infections or illness. As I said, the most relevant part of inflammation in a metabolic context is what's coming from the fat cells. And when fat cells get too big, they become very inflamed. Now, before we judge the fat cell too harshly, I want you to understand why. And you can teach your friend this because it's such a fascinating principle. First and foremost, cells need to be very close, within just a few micrometers of a blood vessel, in order to get sufficient oxygen. But fat cells are capable of expanding to 20 to 30 times volumetrically what it should be. There is no cell in the body that is capable of growing as much as a fat cell can grow. Nothing's even close. Isn't that miserable? Much to our collective dismay. That's the way it is. Unfortunately for the fat cell, when insulin is elevated and there's sufficient calories to fuel the growth that insulin is signaling, the fat cell gets so big that it starts getting pushed further and further away from the capillary. And so basically the fat cell begins to suffocate. The technical term, if you want to impress your friend, you would say that the fat cell is becoming hypoxic. It's hypoxic. That just means it's not getting enough oxygen. And remember, it's not getting enough oxygen because it's gotten too big and it's pushed itself too far away from the capillary. Well, the fat cell doesn't want to suffocate. The poor fat cell wants to survive. And so it begins to produce cytokines. If you have the fat cell and there's not enough capillaries or blood vessels to provide the oxygen, it starts to release all of these cytokines. And the cytokines act like a signal telling the fat cells to make new blood vessels, thereby correcting the hypoxia or correcting the suffocation, which is good. The fat cell does not want to suffocate. And these inflammatory signals, some of them will boost the production of the blood vessels. However, some just begin to circulate through the body, causing inflammation. Now, one of the signals that comes from the big fat cells is something called prostaglandins. Have you ever heard that term before? So prostaglandins are molecules they're very important inflammatory mediators. They're sort of part of the pathway when we think about inflammation. And they will come from fat cells. They activate immune pathways. They also are important parts about clotting blood. One of the reasons why blood clot risk goes up as we gain fat mass is because of this increased prostaglandin activity. Also, part of what contributes to us feeling hotter when we have a fever, prostaglandins contribute to that as well. But let's focus on this immune pathway. So if you really want to dive down, and I'm sorry if this gets a little too specific. This is the first time I'm teaching this, after all, to a kind of academic audience. These prostaglandins will then activate a critical inflammatory mediator. This is a molecule called NF-kappa B. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, whoa, Ben, we're getting way too specific. NF-kappa B is the master regulator of inflammation. You could imagine along the wall of the cell, there's this big switch that says inflammation. NF-kappa B is the one that turns it on. And when NF-kappa B turns that on, it basically the whole immune inflammatory machinery system starts cranking. And part of what it starts producing, if we look at this as now a big busy factory, are cytokines. Have you guys heard of C-reactive protein, or CRP? This is a much more commonly measured clinical marker now. There are some others that are less commonly measured, like TNF-alpha, or a whole family of the interleukins, the IL proteins. There's IL-1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But all of these are inflammatory cytokines that when NF-kappa B goes to that master inflammation switch, all of these start getting produced. And the more these are being produced, this is back to old postdoctoral fellowship Bickman's work, when these are going up, insulin resistance is turning on or insulin sensitivity is coming down. They are a direct cause of insulin resistance. Now, what can you do about it? How can your tools help your friend control this a little better? Well, there is a shocking amount of information, to be honest, a shocking amount of peer-reviewed studies published looking at how yerba mate is capable of, in this case, actually turning the macrophages into an anti-inflammatory scenario. So the macrophage will start to fight the inflammation rather than turn it on. The macrophage can go both ways. It can be pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. This study found that it could directly, in humans, promote an anti-inflammatory milieu or environment. Even further, this study found, once again, in human subjects, it was in men who have a much higher risk of heart disease than women. Ladies, I'm sorry that women weren't included in this. Heart disease is just generally a problem for the men. In fact, men die more of everything, except breast cancer and Alzheimer's disease. But you should worry about the men around you, honestly. Men just die from almost everything more, including just killing themselves. It's really quite unfortunate. And there's no evidence on that here, but even still, look at what happened with yerba mate consumption in these men. CRP, C-reactive protein, which is a better clinical predictor of heart disease than LDL cholesterol is, by the way. CRP went down by 50% in these men by just taking the yerba mate. Interleukin-6 went down by 16%. They didn't measure TNF-alpha in this study, unfortunately. So pretty remarkable findings that you can talk to your friend about. Now, your friend may say, well, how on earth is it resulting in such improvement in inflammation? And you'd say, well, it's inhibiting NF-kappa B. So yerba mate has been shown, some of its molecules, to directly inhibit this master pro-inflammatory switch. Now, have you guys ever heard, one other topic before I leave inflammation behind, have you ever heard of leaky gut? Leaky gut is a real phenomenon. Some people want to pretend it's not. It absolutely is real. What happens there is that the intestinal cells normally are very tight. Imagine a bunch of bends stacked up against each other with our shoulders really pressed against each other, like soldiers with our shoulders together. Nothing is getting past us. This is 155 pounds of pure muscle. Nothing's getting past this lineman here. Yeah, in my dreams, right? So whatever's going to get in is because the cell will say along the wall of the gut, it will say, I recognize you, you can come in. And then a cell will take that, incorporate it into itself, and then pass it into the blood. With leaky gut, it's like the bends now are stepping away from each other. They're letting things come in that should not be coming in. That's something called paracellular transport. It's supposed to come through, now it's going past or right beside. And the most common thing that we care about that comes through is something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. Lipopolysaccharide is a part of bacteria. And now these things which should never come into the body are leaking into the body. And boy, when LPS comes in, it just cranks up NF-kappa B and cranks up inflammation. What about this then? You can tell your friend, I even have something to help with that, because this has been shown, the saponins in yerba mate or in Unimate have been shown to block the effects of LPS in the body. Now, this is blocking the effects of LPS, and your friend may say, well, I just want less LPS to move at all in the first place. Then you say, okay, well, in the Unimate, have the Unimate address the effects of the LPS, turning down the body's response to it. And if you want to reduce the amount of LPS coming in the first place, well, then I have something else to help. Because the prebiotic fibers are going to help those epithelial cells, the bends standing like soldiers, to be very, very functional, very tightly packed in, so that less stuff can slip through the line, can pass through the epithelium. Okay, that's the inflammation part, which, as much as it pains me to say, most people would prefer to talk about that over insulin, and it does pain me to say it. What about stress? Let's finish with this one, and then we can do some Q&A. Okay, now stress also is important. One of the main Now, I had mentioned earlier to you that I teach advanced endocrinology or graduate endocrinology. When I think about stress, and I encourage you to do the same, you should think of the stress hormones. And one of the most prominent among a handful is epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. An interesting feature of epinephrine is that when epinephrine is up, the body typically starts to become less insulin sensitive. Okay, so this is a stress, and when the stress signal is up, insulin sensitivity starts to go down. Now, we'll see how this goes, how I can teach this principle, because there's some nuance here that I hope I'm able to convey to you because it is fascinating. How do we reconcile this with Unimate? Because Unimate has been shown to increase epinephrine. And yet, I just told you, I showed you evidence that Unimate helps control glucose and improve insulin sensitivity. So how do we have both, in the case of Unimate, an increase in epinephrine and an improvement in insulin sensitivity? Well, to understand this, I believe we need to introduce another hormone that you've probably heard of called dopamine. You've heard of dopamine, I bet. Dopamine is an epinephrine opposite. It's the kind of anti-epinephrine in many ways, but not every way. When dopamine goes up, the body becomes more insulin sensitive. Interestingly, dopamine also stimulates fat burning, in fact, substantially. So you can tell your friend some of this nuance and say, if you're stressed, you need to help your dopamine go up. How can I help my dopamine go up? Well, you have a way to help that happen, where yerba mate has been shown to actually promote the survival of dopamine-producing neurons. So you are directly facilitating the survival of these neurons that produce dopamine. So they're a little stressed. You say, wow, we need to try to help your body make a little more dopamine. But remember, you can even make the story more compelling by saying, actually, you have something here that helps with both. It takes advantage of the best parts of epinephrine because among the many things epinephrine will do, one thing it does, well, I got a little ahead of myself, but first and foremost, dopamine will control some of the effects of epinephrine, including offsetting the insulin resistance that epinephrine is trying to produce. But the one thing they do together, they both stimulate fat burning. So this is an incredible dynamic duo when it comes to fat burning. Because again, epinephrine wants to promote insulin resistance, but it also promotes fat burning. One of those is good, one of those isn't. Dopamine is all good. It improves insulin sensitivity and it promotes fat burning. And it controls some of the negative effects of epinephrine. It's basically like these are two siblings. They're both very competent. Epinephrine tends to be the wild child. Dopamine is the good one who keeps epinephrine in line. I have 7 older brothers, so I know what I'm talking about when it comes to keeping some siblings in line. I'm the youngest boy, so I was always the good boy, to be perfectly frank. I was the one trying to tell them to stop doing it. Let's go with that. Okay. All right, so I hope that makes sense. This was, of everything I was about to teach you today, this was the one concept that worried me the most because it's the most nuanced. I want you to understand that stress is a cause of insulin resistance. And then depending on how you choose to talk about this, you can say, yeah, but some stress is good. There is such a thing as good stress, where if you can take advantage of the good parts and help control the bad parts, like the insulin resistance. And the combination of increased epinephrine and increased dopamine, that is a remarkable metabolic combination that collectively is a win. It collectively leaves the body in a better place. Now, what do I mean by good stress? There's a concept in physiology called hormesis. That's a term that you could kind of throw out. It's a really important idea, but it's this idea that a little stress can be good. Lest you think all stress is bad. How can a sauna result in such remarkable improvements in heart disease when you're just sitting there miserably sweating and your heart is pounding? How can something like exercise, that's damaging your body. That causes substantial oxidative stress when you exercise, but it also results in substantial antioxidant defense mechanisms that get turned on and linger. Something like fasting, that's a stress on your body. Ice bath, I know if you're anything like my wife, you're ready to vomit at the very idea of an ice bath. But all of these are things that are a stress on the body, and yet the there's a benefit that outweighs any negative effect. That is hormesis. Hormesis is a term of physiology to imply that within a certain range, this stimulus, which could be noxious or harmful, ends up becoming very beneficial. That's what I would want you to take away when it comes to stress and the effects in particular, the effect of some of the tools you have at your disposal to help your friends and loved ones become more insulin sensitive. So the things I hope you take away from this are that insulin resistance is not only the most common and most relevant health disorder worldwide. I want you to understand what it is, and I want you to understand the three primary causes of it: stress, inflammation, and chronically elevated insulin. And then the good news that you have to help your friend feel great by overcoming and breaking down these three primary pillars of the most common metabolic and overall health disorder worldwide. Thanks for being such willing students, and I'd be happy to answer any questions I can. Thank you.
Thanks for coming and sharing with us.
Hey,
It's
Darren,
always
yeah.
a treat. So Googling around, investigating GLP-1, one of the functions that keeps coming up is that GLP-1 increases insulin secretion in the body,
Yeah.
which makes me wonder, how can it help with insulin resistance? Follow-on question, David Ludwig's review talks about, while GLP-1 stimulates beta cell insulin secretion, the gastric emptying effect kind of overcomes that. So what's really going on there?
Yeah.
And why is GLP-1 do certain things, and then these GLP-1 agonists and these super physiological doses do other things?
Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting even about David Ludwig's paper, and I appreciate you mentioning that one in particular, so there is, unfortunately, across biomedical research, there are three models commonly used: cells, rodents, and humans. That some of those biomedical models will show, like if you have beta cells growing in a culture dish and you put in GLP-1, they will create more insulin. But as you note, you don't want more insulin in the body. Most people are already living in a state of too much all the time. The reality is when you actually put GLP-1 in a human, nothing. So Arnie Ostrup, Astrup, he is a famous scientist in that realm from Denmark. He actually is now he left the University of Copenhagen and took a job as the manager of the wealth fund in Norway that owns Novo Nordisk, which makes Wegovy and Ozempic. I was speaking at a meeting in Switzerland with him late last year. He published a paper in the mid-90s, one of the very first groups ever studying GLP-1. It's his work, actually, that finds when you infuse GLP-1 into humans, you have no insulin secretion. In fact, even with a carbohydrate load, you actually mitigate it. This is Ostrup in probably mid-90s. I can find the paper. So you take that to the bank. In humans, there is no increase in insulin secretion with GLP-1. And definitely not at any physiological levels, certainly. Second question was that it? Did I kind of get both? Yeah, I don't know. I'm unaware of evidence that shows that actually. The overall effect, so when these GLP-1 agonists first came out, I mean, as I said, I have literally been a part of that conversation since the very beginning. I just never could have imagined it would turn into what it's turned into. It's the power of, the moment Kim Kardashian and Elon Musk start bragging about Ozempic, then all hell breaks loose. So when these drugs first hit the market, they were used at a dose that was about 1/8 of the current dose. It wasn't even on their radar to turn it up to the dose they're using now. What's an interesting feature of pharmacology is that you actually file a patent on a dose. Isn't that interesting? So they had the first patent filed on this particular dose, which was this lower Ozempic kind of dose. And then they found when they were using this low dose, the main use of the drug was in type 2 diabetes to correct the high glucose levels. Because as much as I focus on insulin, there's an opposite to insulin called glucagon. And whereas insulin wants to lower blood glucose levels, glucagon wants to increase blood glucose levels. And anyone who's a diabetic, type 1 or type 2, always has high glucagon, and that's always driving their blood sugar levels up. Well, GLP-1 drugs at that low dose inhibit glucagon. And by inhibiting glucagon, you can bring down the blood sugar levels and you're making their diabetes better. However, they noticed, even at that low dose, some people found that they weren't eating as much. They weren't as hungry and they were losing weight. Well, that's when they really leaned into it. And they said, well, let's just multiply it by 5 and give them this 5x dose. And then they filed a new patent, called it a new drug. It's literally the exact same molecule. And now that's resulting in this weight loss because they're basically slowing their stomach down. Now, one more just thought on that, because it's so remarkable. When someone goes in for a surgery and they're going to go under general anesthesia, they'll typically tell them fast for 24 hours because they don't want anything in the stomach lest the person vomit that out and then inhale it in and they start to get kind of some pneumonia. They start suffocating on their own vomit. What they found, however, is that if people were on these GLP-1 drugs, even 24 hours with eating nothing, they still had food in their stomach. That food should have left 18 hours ago because it only should be sticking around for 4 or 5 hours. Independent or related to that, people on these drugs will find that they have what's called Ozempic burps, where the food is sitting in their stomach for so long that it's literally putrefying. And now they have these noxious fumes bubbling up their esophagus and they're burping, and it's horrific because it's like they're rotting food in their stomach. This is why 3 out of every 4 people on the drugs get off them 2 years in, because they just get sick of feeling sick. But even those who stay on the drug, there was a paper published, and I don't remember the citation, but I vividly remember the figure. It looked at the reduction in sweet cravings. Because let's admit it, that's one of the things that we want to indulge in the most, right? They looked at the sweet cravings. The moment the person started the drug, within just a few months, sweet cravings had dropped. As they continued on the drug, at 12 months, here was baseline. 6 months, boom. At 12 months, oh, it creeped up a bit. 18 months, creeped up a bit. 24 months, it was right back where they started. Even though they were still on the drug, their cravings had come right back. This is the power. The problem with those drugs is that it's trying to remove the person's discipline. They're not learning any strategies. It is a drug-induced artificial improvement in cravings. The reality is it's a bit of a hard slog. You're dealing with deep-seated dietary habits. You want to help your friend with something that's going to last longer than 2 years. And I think you can. Okay, what else?
Ben, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, hey, Trent.
I'm going to ask 3 questions. You pick the one you want to respond to, because I can't pick one.
Trent and I go to church together, by the way.
Yeah.
We go to the same church building every Sunday. Okay, just for that alone, I'm going to answer all 3. Go.
Okay, number 1, what's so bad about blood sugar spikes? We hear spikes. You avoid the spike, the blood sugar spike. Can you maybe tell everybody why a spike is something to be worried about?
Yeah. So there's a lot of nuance there, but I really appreciate the question. So one given spike, if it were one spike every 24 hours, I'd say all right. Now, however, so the problem is most people don't just have one spike. But as much as we see blood sugar come up and down, remember, blood insulin is at least going to be about 3 hours. And depending on the person, it may be up for 5 or 6 hours just from one blood sugar spike. So as much as we look at the glucose, because we can measure it with a continuous glucose monitor, if we also had a continuous insulin monitor, which is at least 10 years away from happening, it's so complicated, we would see that while the glucose came up and down, the insulin had a much bigger curve. So always keep your other eye on the other curve that you can't see. Because you just can't quantify insulin like this. Now, however, even an acute blood sugar spike activates the sympathetic nervous system. So if you've ever done this, you may feel a little hotter. Your heart will be beating a little harder. The great tragedy of human physiology and habits and addictions even is that the one time we are the most tempted to indulge in stuff like this is right before we go to bed. That is the absolute worst time to spike your blood sugar, because then you're laying in bed and you're wondering why you're so anxious. You're hot, you're bothered, your heart is beating hard and racing. It's not because you're actually anxious, it's because you activated your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, all because of the hyperglycemia. So what looks like a benign up and down not only is far less benign when we look at it in the context of insulin, but when we include the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic part of our body, which is, again, the fight or flight, it activates that fight or flight response. So we don't want to do that. I mean, maybe you say, well, I want to do that if I'm going to go run a marathon. All right, well, then do it when you run a marathon, not at 9 p.m. when you're sitting on your couch.
Thanks. Second question. Having been somebody that struggled with every diet I ever tried for several years and really focused on calories and calorie reduction, and I felt like all my results were checkered at best because I wasn't focused on insulin. So can you talk about why, if we're going to cut calories, we have to consider insulin as well instead of just cutting calories?
Yeah. That's an awesome question. I actually have a full lecture on that idea alone that I've given in the past. So yeah, typically, when you think about metabolic health, it's more important that you always remember, more than the mass of fat someone has, it's the size of the fat cells. So as much as we think about losing fat, I actually want you to be thinking, well, it's more about shrinking fat cells. Because, for example, if you just went to a plastic surgeon and got a bunch of liposuction, you've just lost 20 pounds of pure fat, and there's not a single metabolic marker that's improved. Not one. These people who get liposuction, they just look better in their Speedos. And Trent has a whole closet of Speedos. No, I'm kidding. He doesn't want to break up any happy marriages. You'll never see him in a Speedo. So, but you've lost all that fat. If it were just a matter of fat mass, you should be better, but you're not. No metabolic marker or cardiometabolic marker gets better. It's because you didn't shrink the fat cells. So freezing fat cells, sucking fat cells out, sure, you'll have less fat, but you won't be even a whit healthier than you were before. So as much as we focus on weight loss or fat loss, to be more precise, always be thinking shrinking fat cells. Now, there are two ways to shrink fat cells: cutting calories or cutting insulin, reducing insulin, I should say. Now, the problem with the classic approach, which is purely based on thermodynamics and calories in, calories out, is that if you don't address the high insulin, which no one ever does, then you're left in a state of profound hunger. Now, what do I mean by that? If your calories coming in drops, but your insulin levels are still high, insulin's main effect throughout the entire body is to store energy. So at any moment, if insulin is still elevated, it's taking any of the calories in your blood and it's pushing them into the cells of your body. It's telling the muscle cells, the liver cells, the fat cells, hey, you store all this energy. And those tissues will store it fine, because if insulin's high, they have to obey. Insulin is saying store energy. Now, there's an important tissue that cannot store energy, and that's the brain. The brain must be constantly pulling energy from the blood. And that's relevant because it has such a high metabolic rate. The brain is always hungry for energy. So if the brain can't be pulling in any more energy because the high insulin is still up, but the calories are down, it says, I'm hungry. And hunger always wins. If you guys have ever looked at that Biggest Loser game show, how many times do we ever see a reunion tour? Never. Every one of those people gains it all back. And just one last point on this. Did you need to stop me for something?
Stop the screen share.
Yes.
Those on the Zoom can see you.
Oh, yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. One little analogy. Let's imagine that Trent, who lives just right in my neighborhood, right up the street from me, Trent says, hey, team, I'm having a big buffet at my house. I want all of you to come and eat. I have the best chefs in the world. It's the best food you can imagine. Come hungry. What are we going to do to come to Trent's buffet as hungry as possible? I bet there would be two things that we would do. We would eat a little less and we would exercise a little more, and it would work. We would come to that buffet very hungry. Now you see the problem. That is the advice we've been giving people for 60 years, 70 years, how to lose weight. Eat less, exercise more. Sure, you'll lose a little weight, but hunger always wins. So let's come back to that paradigm. We are on a fat cell shrinking journey. If the first step is just cutting calories without addressing insulin, we'll find that we're right back at the starting line. So the first step must be cutting insulin. That's the first step. If we address insulin through control carbs, in particular, that is the first step always. Control carbs. Focus on, eat as much of anything else as you want. When you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat. And not eating becomes easier because when insulin is low, the body cannot hold on to its fat. As I know this is still tremendously debated, but the evidence is so precise. If you take someone with type 1 diabetes and they just simply skip an insulin injection, they will be as skinny as they want and they can eat thousands of calories a day. It's a terribly tempting eating disorder, or a form of an eating disorder called diabulimia. But it is absolute proof positive that if insulin is low, the body cannot store fat. It is literally impossible. The person can be eating thousands of calories in excess. Now, where does the energy go? Two things that for you to keep track of or to note. One, if insulin is low, metabolic rate goes up by several hundred calories a day. Even in your life, if you ate the exact same number of calories in a day, but it was calories that allowed your insulin to stay low because you were controlling your carbs, always rule number one, your metabolic rate will be about 300 calories a day higher. That's a lot of time on the stair stepper. Or just control your carbs and lower your insulin. And second, when your insulin is low, you're burning so much fat, you can't stop burning fat when insulin is low, because insulin is the only signal that tells the body to stop burning fat. And you start making ketones from that fat. You've heard of ketones before. As much as they are vilified and maligned, always inappropriately, ketones are simply a product of fat burning. And the brain loves ketones. And so if you have ketones in your blood, it suppresses appetite. And thus fasting becomes easier because the brain has an abundance of energy. People say that the brain prefers glucose, or the glucose is its preferred fuel. That is absolutely false. The moment ketones start to come into the blood, even if they are way lower than the blood glucose levels, the brain is already getting most of its energy from the ketones. The brain thrives on ketones. So to sum it all up, there are two ways to shrink your fat cells. Yes, reducing energy is one way, but don't ever start with that step. The first step is reducing your insulin by controlling carbs. Now, a person may find, I've taken that first insulin step, I lost weight, but I have more to go. Now you say you're in a good position to take the next step of cutting calories, but don't do so by a low-fat, low-calorie type diet. Now you do so by frequently fasting. So that comes second for a reason. That should not be the first one. In my mind, if a person starts with fasting, they're putting themselves in a position to get really hungry, and it turns into a bit of a binge purge kind of fasting style where they say, I'm going to fast for 24 hours, and then they just eat a bunch of junk food at the end of it, and then they feel stuffed, and they feel sick, they feel shame, and then they say, I'm going to do better tomorrow, and they do the exact same thing tomorrow. So more important, when your friend is ready to frequently fast, you tell them, more important than how long you fast is what you eat when you break your fast. So when the fast is ending, that's the moment that matters most.
Thank you. And I want to give the mic to somebody else. Thank you so much. And to validate what you just said, I mean, since starting this protocol, weight has come off effortlessly and it has stayed off. So by focusing on insulin.
It works.
As I'm passing the microphone away, just tell us, is there a benefit to working out in a fasted state versus a fed state if all calories remain the same throughout the day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my answer to that question is it depends what the goals are. If you are training for an Ironman, Darren, do you still do Ironmans? No, you've wised up. I don't blame you. It's crazy. Yeah, so if you are training for an Ironman, then I'd say don't exercise fasted. Get something in you. If you are a middle-aged guy who's trying to keep his wife happy, fast. Exercise fasted.
I'm that one.
You're there with me. Yeah.
Great to have you here. This Novo Nordisk.
Yeah.
You talk about the Ozempic, the Wegovy, but then there's Mounjaro. Is that part of that same family?
Sure is.
Different.
Mhm. It sure is. Yeah,
And then
they're all
where do you
part of the same.
see the whole Nordisk thing going? Do they just take over the world and everybody goes up just
Yeah.
sucking on that stuff, or does it go away
You know
eventually?
what? I actually have a talk. The talk I gave in, actually I've given a version of it here too. So that's not going away anytime soon. What's so remarkable about how the field is continuing to evolve, They're continuing to lean into the incretins to stimulate weight loss by slowing the guts. The problem when you slow the guts is you basically break digestion down. And so the person starts to become very malnourished. And that's the reason why they're losing so much muscle and bone mass. So what the future direction is going to be is trying to couple the profound weight loss of these drugs and combine it with a drug that helps to maintain muscle mass. It will never work. Because these drugs that maintain muscle mass, there's a hormone, there's a protein called myostatin. And there in humans, we first found this, there are some humans who have a mutation in the myostatin gene and they become very muscled, just naturally very muscled. This is taken advantage of in cattle. You can block this myostatin protein and get them really big, really muscled and get way more meat. There have been attempts to block this in human clinical trials, and it just causes cancer all the time. If you try to stop something, if you stop its ability to stop growing, that's, of course, cancer. So what I imagine the future of this field is going to be is no way are they going to be turning back from these GLP-1 based drugs. They just result in so much weight loss, and the market just continues to climb. It is not plateauing even. It's just continuing to go up. They're going to just continue to try to go polypharma and say, yes, you're taking this drug, now also take this drug to undo the side effects of that. And then there's going to be another drug to undo those side effects. That is what polypharma is all about. And everyone who starts on a drug for these kinds of lifestyle problems, it never stops with one. This is why, if I bring it back to type 2 diabetes, which is where the GLP-1 drugs started, this is why they say type 2 diabetes is irreversible. Uncurable, irreversible, because the standard of care is start with this drug. You're going to start with metformin. Then the metformin stops working. Okay, or they have muscle pain because of it, or GI problems. Okay, well, let's add this drug on. And then it has problems and it starts working less and less effectively. Well, then let's add this drug on. So within time, they started with one drug, now they're on 6. That's a very common number, all to control originally one single problem, which is that their blood sugar levels are too high because they're insulin resistant. So the same thing is just going to happen here. The great tragedy in all of this, of course, is that it's the food we eat that is the culprit when it comes to these metabolic problems, but thus it's the food we eat that can also be the cure. So what we put in our mouths is either the culprit or the cure. You are in a position to help it be on the latter of the two.
Hi. First of all, I follow you on Instagram. I repost your stuff all
Awesome,
the time.
awesome.
I've read your book. It felt like you're saying everything I've been trying to teach people for a long time. I wanted to ask you, so I've done peptide training, and semaglutide is a peptide, and people using peptides have gotten good results, but using it in very small doses.
Mhm.
And the problem here is the poison is in the dose.
Yep.
And the dose used for weight loss is even much higher than originally used for the diabetes
Yep.
dose. So is there anything that you can comment on as far as recommendations if someone was already on one of these medications, if they were to lower the dose and then combine it with something like Unimate or the Feel Great system?
That's exactly what I say. In fact, I probably shouldn't say this. There's a company who has found that, I mentioned a moment ago that the patent is in the dose. There's a company that's attempting to patent a low dose and couple it with a low carb diet. That's like going to be the whole standard of care. So absolutely. The fact is, again, when these drugs first came out and they were used at the lower doses, I was a huge advocate of them. I thought these drugs are remarkable effects, but it's just when the dose kept creeping up and up and up. So if someone's on the drug, I would say with your healthcare provider, start to wean yourself off as well as you can, get to the least effective dose, and then combine it with some substantial lifestyle change. That is absolutely what I tell people to do for the reasons you just elaborated on.
I couldn't figure out how to word my question, so I'm just gonna say what's.
Please, remember, I'm used to dealing with 18 and 19-year-olds, so pretty much anything you say is I can make sense of.
Okay, so what does the science say about like autoimmune disorders like
Mhm.
psoriatic arthritis? Because I've heard it all starts in the gut and that like what these things kind of elevate CRP,
Yeah.
which increases the cardiovascular. So if we can attack hyperinsulinemia, can we control these like with lifestyle?
That's a good question. Yeah, so no, just to answer that last part of that question directly, if a person has an autoimmune disease, addressing the metabolic health is not going to, addressing the insulin resistance is not going to improve the autoimmune disease. But addressing the autoimmune disease will improve the insulin resistance. So for example, there's a paper, one of the papers I think I link on that slide earlier, or that I have a reference to, is a paper of rheumatoid arthritis, which is autoimmune, not psoriatic arthritis. But in this paper, has been shown in other autoimmune diseases, autoimmune conditions will ebb and flow. And as you see the autoimmune conditions subside or become more aggressive, you can track the insulin resistance with it almost perfectly, which is just further testament to how relevant inflammation is. However, you did say something that I think is very relevant, which is the gut. Every autoimmune disease I'm aware of has an environmental trigger. A person isn't just born with an autoimmune disease that is active at the time of birth. It is something that develops later. Type 1 diabetes, it starts later in life. Celiac disease, it starts later in life. Any of these arthritic rheumatoid or autoimmune conditions, they start later when the kid starts to eat stuff or we start to breathe stuff or put certain things on our skin. So the most important vehicle for this is absolutely the gut. Now, what I'm about to say will sound a little controversial, so please take this as just coming from a scientist. I know people, in fact, I am an advisor for a healthcare company, not a supplement company, but a healthcare company whose main focus is getting people off their medications for their autoimmune diseases, where there are individuals with just debilitating Crohn's disease, which is these kind of damage of the whole digestive tract from mouth to bottom. And like to the point that they're dying from malnutrition. They just substantially change their diet. And the only way to do this is just heavy elimination diets. And the whole problem goes away. And and you're wondering, well, where's the controversy? It's because they basically put them on carnivore diets. Humans are very well adapted to eating other animals. And within the plant realm, many plants that we have grow now are fine, but some aren't in some people. And please don't take what I'm saying too far or think that I'm being extreme. If I hadn't seen some of the data myself, I would not even talk about it. But the results of some of these findings are so mind-boggling. The correction and what people who wanted to die, their autoimmune disease was so bad. So to wrap all of that up in a little tidy bow, an autoimmune disease requires an environmental trigger. And if you can identify the environmental trigger, then it's gone. In most instances, it's very difficult to identify the environmental trigger because it can be anything that is going in or on your body. But to then bring it to the final step for this lecture, if it is aggravating an autoimmune condition, you will be compounding the problem by causing insulin resistance. So the insulin resistance will be a consequence of the autoimmune disease, which itself is going to be a consequence of some environmental trigger. It's a good question.
Well, Dr. Beckman, I'm just excited to meet you in person. I'm learning
Thanks for coming.
so much about insulin resistance. It's just crazy how I missed that for so long. So on a call that we had yesterday, one of my partners really is like beating me up all day today. And I was like, oh my God, I'll ask Dr. Beckman. Teenagers using the Feel Great system. And her concern was, just the disproportionate, I guess, spectrum of what they're doing with their bodies and the concern, and then the athletes. What would be your professional advice for us to give to our parents with kids who are athletes and have major issues with kids not wanting to eat properly and all that good stuff?
Oh, I am incredibly sympathetic to that concern. As a parent of 3 kids at home now, I think about what I'm feeding them all the time and what they're eating. And the little miscreants only want to eat junk food all the time. So now you'd asked about a very specific population, which is the teen athlete. Now, of course, I'm not a clinician. Remember, I'm your friendly neighborhood professor. That is my role. I'm the scientist. So thanks for letting me always speak on that topic. So teenage years are an interesting time because as much as I talk about insulin resistance as purely pathogenic or harmful, there is something known as physiological insulin resistance, which is when the body has become insulin resistant for a purpose. And that purpose is always one thing, which is growth. So there are the 2 Ps. You can tell I'm a college professor because I try to make everything very memorable. I want everything I say to be memorable because I'm always competing with my students' Instagram. You know, they want to be doing this and I want them to be doing this. And you all did a very good job. You're more motivated than my students are, whose parents are paying their tuition. So the 2 Ps of physiological insulin resistance, puberty and pregnancy. Both of those are periods of explosive growth, incredible growth, very rapid growth. Whether it's the pregnant mom who's growing a little baby and getting ready to feed that baby, so she needs a lot of extra fuel on her, or whether it's the teen who's going through this incredible change. So insulin resistance is a natural part. Now, that's not what you asked, but I just wanted to share it with you guys. Now, let's talk about the teen. And now I have to speculate a little bit because there's no studies that have looked at yerba mate or prebiotic fibers in teen athletes, because that was the unique population you mentioned. But I cannot conceive of any harm here. Indeed, when it comes to athletics, the overwhelming evidence is that yerba mate is beneficial. In fact, some of what Darren did years ago was go out and interview one of the world record holders for 100-mile runs. Now, that's a very unique type of sporting event for very particularly insane people. But he would use like 5 Unimate packets at a time during his event. So when it comes to physical performance, Unimate, to me, it would be a slam dunk. If I had a kid who needed something and wanted some help during a game with energy, for me and my own child, I would have no problem suggesting it.
Making sure they had enough calories during their eating time.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. So when it comes to a teen, I don't think fasting is ever needed. I don't think a structured fast is necessary unless it's a child who is very overweight and we're worried about that. But even then, it's such a delicate time, but it's an important time too. Just so that you're aware, typically if a teen can come out of puberty relatively lean, the likelihood of them staying lean forever is enormous. So that is an important time. Also, the number of fat cells a person has when they get out of puberty is typically the same number of fat cells they'll have until they're 70. That fat cell number becomes very, very static. So it is a very important time. Now, that need not foster any sort of depression, because remember, it's the size of the fat cells that matter most. And as a reminder, girls naturally will have more fat cells than boys purely because of estrogens. That's supposed to be that way and it's healthier. That's why women are fatter than men and healthier than men at the same time, because they have more fat cells than their male counterparts do. And more fat cells means smaller fat cells. Anyway, so fasting, I think for teens, don't do it. Don't promote it. Don't force it. I say that also as a dad of daughters. And as a college professor, the number of girls I see with eating disorders just breaks my heart. And it worries me enormously that my daughters would ever hear dad talking too much about this stuff and them start to become overly mindful or thinking that I'm critical and now they're being too critical of themselves. No, heaven forbid. Heaven forbid.
Not to be interpreted with overeating and snacking in between all of those meals.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Guys, no, hold on. Other hands are going up, but I'm totally deferring to the microphone, just so there's some order.
Yeah, I just have a question on yerba mate and intermittent fasting and cellular senescence.
Yeah.
I mean, I push a lot of my patients into this intermittent fasting protocol because I think it's one of the best things we can do, especially with elderly patients. Does yerba mate influence the destruction of senescent cells, or do you know if there's any influence at all? Because that's one of the things I wouldn't want to change, especially with their intermittent fasting. So I would like that to move upwards rather than downwards.
So right. I don't want to, when I look at the benefit of senescence, I believe the benefit is autophagy. That a question there would be, how can I put the body in a state to take advantage of autophagy, the process of a cell rejuvenating or renewing itself? Interestingly, you'll hear a lot of longevity gurus talk about autophagy, and there's actually no way to measure autophagy. You can't do it. It's purely in humans. It's purely in the realm of kind of theoretical based on cell-based studies. Now, autophagy is a real thing, and from individual cells, you can measure it. So speaking of the benefits of senescence, I would say the benefit is autophagy. Then how can you take advantage of autophagy? Fasting is absolutely the way to do it. So anytime insulin is low, autophagy turns on. And now there's two ways to turn on autophagy then. One is what I call, I've never talked about this in a unicity framework, and I'm going to talk about it for the first time. I've thought a lot about it. I've wondered how I can bring it up, and now I'm going to. So the first way is through a caloric fast, which is what you're talking about with intermittent fasting. If you have these structured periods where you're not eating or drinking any calories, insulin must come down because it is the hormone of the fed state. It cannot stay up in a fasted state. It must come down. So a caloric fast is a way to do it, but you have to eat sometime. Then I think the power of insulin and autophagy and senescence is a nutrient fast. This is a term that other people don't talk about, but I'm bringing it to life right now. A nutrient fast is when you are eating calories, but your calories are such that your insulin is staying low. And that's the power of this control carbs being the first rule. If you are fueling the body, but it's primarily proteins and fats with little to no insulin effect, you do not stop autophagy because it's not the calorie that stops autophagy, it's the insulin from those calories. And so as much as in the insect studies, in the animal studies, if you can promote autophagy, you promote longevity. So it stands to reason that the same thing will happen in humans, although we could never actually do those studies and follow humans to death for their whole life.
But I guess the question is, will yerba mate influence it? For the
Right.
better or for the worse?
Absolutely for the better. Yep. So yerba mate has molecules that will stimulate autophagy. In fact, that ought to be a topic in and of itself, and it very well could be. So yes, sorry, thanks for bringing me back. Absolutely, yes. Not only a direct effect of some of the molecules like EGCG, but then even the facilitatory effect of promoting a fast. Yeah, that's a great question.
Hi there.
Hey there.
So you started with insulin sensitivity and how it's low and bad things associated with that. And then you spoke about 3 primary components to that.
Yep.
And you talked about these products that have components that will help mitigate that. But then the next logical step is how does that really relate back to what you started with, insulin sensitivity? Is there any evidence that this will increase insulin sensitivity? And if so, what's the time constant on that?
The time on that? Yeah. So yes, a resounding yes. Yeah. I mean, that was a very big part of what I hoped to convey today, that as much as we have the 3 primary causes of insulin resistance, stress, inflammation, elevated insulin, the 2 components of the feel great system, the Unimate and the feel great imbalance rather, each of those actually has an effect at improving those 3 primary causes. So a resounding yes, that these are going to work. And I introduced you even to some of the mechanisms. The rate at which it improves, it depends on where the person is starting. I've published a paper using some of these same tools, finding that in 90 days, you can take humans that are just diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and stop it entirely. It's totally gone without ever a pill popped or a needle injected. So I think 90 days is a very realistic time frame. Depending on where the person's starting, even 30 days. To be honest, in some instances, even 2 weeks. So the nice thing about this is, as much as the metabolic problem is severe and very prevalent, it is also very, very reversible. So 90 days is an absolute yes from full-blown type 2 diabetes.
All right, to circle back around what Beverly said. So my son just turned 15 a couple of months ago. He's 15, 6'4", 247 pounds, and about 20% body fat. So he's playing football, of course. So the coaches said that they wanted him to come in August at school year, 260, but about 13 to 14.
60 or
260, 260 pounds.
So bigger, 40 pounds bigger.
13 pounds bigger. He's
Oh,
two,
where was he starting?
he's 247
Oh,
now.
okay, okay.
They want him to go to
Wow.
260.
And he's 15?
Yeah,
Sheesh.
right. And it probably doesn't help because I have an ice cream and donut shop that he's working at right now. So.
That definitely doesn't help.
So with the Unimante, it's like, with that, because he's looking for something, because he's training 2 days, he's like, they're at this level where these student athletes are looking to take something to enhance their performance that is not dirty or restricted, anything like that.
Yeah.
And so, as Beverly mentioned about the Unimante, would that be something that's clean for him that would actually work?
Yeah. So I have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, that's a big kid, and you want that to be as much muscle mass as possible, and he wants it. So I'd make sure you're saying, look, they want you to gain 13 pounds. Let's make sure that is beastly mass that is going to make you faster and hit harder and run, move better. So make sure that it is a focus on muscle mass, which needs to be, I mean, if a kid's trying to gain 13 pounds, let's say 15 pounds of pure muscle, you want him not to be hungry, that he's got to be working hard and eating a lot of protein and fat, because that is literally what muscle is made of. This is not made of carbohydrate. It is literally made of protein and fat. That is the very substance of the muscle. But make sure that it is protein and fat, because you absorb the protein better when the fat is with it, and it's more anabolic. I would say, yes, Unimate will help. I would also strongly encourage him, again, as your friendly neighborhood professor, to be getting a few grams of creatine every day and maybe taking it before his workout. I'd take creatine in the morning, and you could take it anytime, and then take the Unimate before his exercise sessions. But then, I mean, do your very best just to let that mass be muscle mass, not fat mass, because that's such a critical time. And you don't, and not only with just how many fat cells you're going to keep, but also what habits are you laying down now in life? And if it's a habit of him eating to gain weight, then I would worry that, well, how hard is it going to be to break that habit when he's 30? And now, he's got a type 2 diabetes problem potentially. So yeah, Unimate will have no problem. Now, again, please remember, I'm speculating. There's truly no studies on this in teens. So I can only speculate, but there's nothing there that I'm aware of that would be any problem at all. But for the sake of his workouts, creatine absolutely helps. There's no question. And then muscle and protein and fat, particularly in the morning. In the morning, when your greatest catabolic or breakdown state, make sure he gets protein. No bowl of cereal. I'd say anything you can do to kind of have like a Rocky style shake, or 6 eggs and bacon with some butter. If that morning can be fat and protein, boy, then you're building. So the morning protein is the most important time.
Out of respect for Dr. Bittman's time, this will be the last question for the Q&A session.
No
Shoot.
pressure. Last.
I know, which was kind of like a couple in one.
Yeah, no problem.
So you had mentioned that the number of fat cells you have like out of puberty is the number that you kind of have throughout, which makes me think, okay, well, if you don't have as many as out of puberty, is that going to so you're not going to, or you may become more insulin resistant quicker or at a lower weight, like fat,
Cool. That's a brilliant question.
And then also the other one was just statins. I've heard maybe before that they help, or that they create insulin resistance. So that was kind of my things there.
Great questions. So in fact, that first question is very, very astute. So if you went through puberty very, very lean and then gained weight later, do you have a lower threshold for that weight gain? You'll recall when I first spoke here a year or so ago, I talked about the personal fat threshold. Actually, it's possible you could in men. Women, because of estrogens, have a much greater capacity to make new fat cells even later in life, particularly gals on the buttocks and hip. And that's purely an estrogen phenomenon. So if it's a woman, it's less of a concern, but possible if it's a man, it's a greater concern, because he doesn't have hormones that tell him to make new fat cells. He's generally going to be set. But that is very much the case across various ethnicities. As I've touched on before, I did my postdoctoral fellowship with Duke Medical School, but in Singapore of all places, beautiful, lovely, tropical Singapore. Why did the Singapore government want scientists to come study diabetes? It's because they were wondering about the kind of ethnic spectrum. Why would you have a Caucasian kind of European white guy who gains 10 pounds and he's perfectly fine, he's just chubbier, but you look at the same 10 pounds gained in a Chinese guy or a South Asian guy, and he is now fatty liver, hypertension, infertility, every metabolic problem you can imagine. It's because his body can't make new fat cells very well or has a lower number like you'd alluded to. So anyway, I'm getting a little off topic, but yeah, I mean, it's possible that if you went through puberty very, very lean, you'd have a lower potential to hold fat later in life. Statins, the evidence in women is very damning when it comes to statins causing insulin resistance. I'm unaware of evidence in men, but women who go on statins have a 50% greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes, all things considered. And what's so tragic is that they're on the statins because of their cholesterol levels, and yet type 2 diabetes is a far stronger predictor of heart disease and heart attack risk. And so you're actually increasing the greatest risk factor for heart disease, which is type 2 diabetes. It's not even close. When you compare LDL as a risk factor, it's almost irrelevant when you compare it to type 2 diabetes. It is way stronger of a risk factor. So I have exceptionally strong feelings about statins. I believe them. Remember, thanks again for letting me just speak as your friendly neighborhood professor, not your clinician, and not on behalf of any other organization but myself. I think statins are one of the most overprescribed medications on the planet, and they should never be prescribed until a person has had their coronary artery calcium score measured. So you can do a CT scan of the amount of calcium in the arteries of the coronary arteries, the arteries of the heart. And if that is less than 100, there's no mortality benefit to the statins whatsoever. If that number is over 100, then there is evidence to suggest statins do improve mortality from heart disease, but it may cause other problems like muscle pain, increased risk of dementia, increased risk of diabetes, particularly in women. So women appear to be much more sensitive to statins, the harms of the statins, and it could just be in part because women just don't die as much from heart disease like men do. So it could be something else that gets them. But even still, even in a man, regardless of what the blood lipid levels are, I would strongly recommend getting a CAC scan because again, if they're less than 100, and many of you are probably at 0, I am at 0. When I measured about a year ago, there's no suggested benefit of a statin. I actually gave a talk on that effect to the Intermountain Health, IHC in Utah, the big hospital system, to their cardiology unit. And boy, they were angry. And I just said, well, then show me data that proves me wrong, you schmucks. Because I was just showing them study after study. And I said, show me the data. Well, you don't have it?
On that
note.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bickman. It's so wonderful to have you here. Stick around for all the questions. Thank you for everyone who came here so that you could participate in the Q&A. We really love it. I know that we had 500 people watching it and 400 stuck around for the Q&A. And so it's very, very helpful. We will be sharing the recording through your Unicity office in the announcements section next week. And so you'll be able to come back and do another review. But yeah, thank you, Dr. Bickman.
Class is over. Thanks, guys.